Good evening. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. My name is Sophie Cordery, and I'm the Education Fellow here at OMAA. I would first like to extend a very warm welcome to you all for joining us today for our penultimate lecture of the season, which accompanies the current exhibition in these three galleries entitled Gisela McDaniel and Nina. Would also like to sincerely thank our season sponsors, Fotine and Thomas Cote, Thomas Keys and Keith Fox, as well as the sponsors of this fantastic exhibition, Pamela and William Sawyer, OMAA's Art Advisory Council members, Leslie and Michael Weissman, Matthew Ogalong, and the Woodward Pomeroy Trust. Please join me in a round of applause for their generous support. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Amy Rahn, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Maine at Augusta and Director of UMA's Charles Danforth Gallery. Among her many accomplishments, Dr. Rahn wrote the first English language dissertation on Joan Mitchell and authored an essay for the Joan Mitchell Retrospective Exhibition Catalog published by Yale University Press in 2021. Her research and curatorial work focus on American modern and contemporary art with particular attention to post-war painting and women artists. She examines how female friendship and community create generative spaces for artistic practice. Her talk will highlight a long tradition in art history of community building and empowerment by women artists who overcome structures of power, lending context to Gisela McDaniel's practice, foundationally built upon collaborations with women and femme-presenting subject collaborators in portraiture. Without further ado, please join me in a warm round of applause for Dr. Amy Rahn.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you this evening. Can everybody hear me? Are all the various microphones working? Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm so honored to be with you tonight. Thank you so much, Sophie and Devin, for inviting me to give this talk this evening. And in the spirit of community and collaboration, I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Lisa Botchen from UMA, for reading a draft of this talk and giving me comments, and my friend, the painter, Susie Spence, for also giving me support in preparing this talk. And of course, my husband, Pete, who's back there. Often now, we offer land acknowledgements at the beginning of conversations like this one. I know they can at times feel rote and performative, but I believe they're an important ideological part of our conversation and should be spoken into our gatherings. And most of all, this one, when we're in the presence of works by a diasporic, indigenous Shamaru artist whose paintings bring us into the understandings specific to her community. This museum stands on the unceded homeland of the Wabanaki, Indakina, and Pennacook peoples. This is from an extremely cool app called Native Land that you can download, and then you can see wherever you are who the original inhabitants of that land were. In a time when the issue of immigration is being used to criminalize people for where they live and forcibly remove them from their lives and families, it feels especially important to remember that we are living and sharing a conversation today on land that was taken from its original inhabitants, people who stewarded this land for thousands of years, and yet whose claims to sovereignty continue to be contested in our courts and legislatures. In these circumstances, I view myself as a guest on this land, in this museum, and in the company of these works and the indigenous knowledge and communities they share with us. Tonight, here with these works, I want to think about the ways artists hold community in and outside of the art they make, and how centering these lateral connections that support art can open onto new views of not only McDaniel's work, but the work of other contemporary artists. McDaniel's works are so clearly about community, about care and relationality, that they give us a way to think of more paintings this way, paintings that don't give us such an open window into their sociality. McDaniel's works show how artists' relationships to their chosen people, the ways they hear each other's stories and share gifts and time, are not just at the root of her paintings, but at the root of so much contemporary art. To begin, I'll give a brief context for this approach to studying art and artists, then offer two examples via the 20th century painter Joan Mitchell, already mentioned, and then Gisela McDaniel to show how this framework might offer new ways of seeing contemporary art. Some of you might have taken art history in college, and some of you might have even liked it. And shout out here to Sarah in the front row, who told me on the trolley that she loved her art history class at Mount Holyoke. What originally drew me to art history was the way it made history concrete and active in the present. Art history shows that art is time travel. Artworks are primary documents that survive the past to be interpreted and reinterpreted in the present. As exciting as I think it is, though, art history hasn't always been taught in a way that inspires. In fact, until fairly recently, it was usually taught as a memorization project for which students were expected to memorize artworks by their titles, artist, date of creation, and cultural period. And I will just confess my full nerdiness and say that I also liked that. Looking at the screen now, some of you may have broken out into a light sweat trying to remember the exact date of creation of this sculpture. I'll give you the caption so you can stop worrying. Art history, as it was conceived by Giorgio Vasari in the 1500s and then consolidated especially in the 18th through the 20th centuries, looked at the world from what we can now understand as a colonizing Western perspective that, following Enlightenment framings arising from Europe and what would eventually become our United States, viewed colonization of indigenous lands by Europeans and the elevation of European art, culture, language, medicine, and lifeways as equivalent to progress, a view of modern history that was long unquestioned in the United States and Europe. In keeping with its Enlightenment roots and other related projects like Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, art historians classified the world's cultural traditions into cultural, regional, and ethnic groups, artistic styles and movements keyed to dates and locations, and ideas of artistic influence that involved a more senior artist teaching an apprentice younger one in a guild or guild-like system. This helped establish the idea of artistic schools, in quotes, in which an established artist's influence was visible in the work of his, yes, nearly always his, followers. So here's an example of sort of Caravaggio, and then followers are called Caravagistes. With the consolidated role of the French Academy starting in 1635, a formal structure of training artists and tracking them toward noble and royal patronage meant that an artist's identity was linked practically in terms of commissions, and also stylistically and critically and even politically with their art education. Art historians became accustomed to looking at the more informal school, in other words, to which senior artist an artist was allied, and formalized art training, which we might think of as school, as the key ways to map artistic influence, which was assumed to flow from one established male artist to an emerging male artist ad infinitum. As you will probably see in my framing, the profound emissions that this structure perpetuated established art historical importance and framed artistic influence. The fine arts, as they were established in Europe, were designed to train and celebrate the achievements of European male artists. The feminist scholar and artist Mira Shore has cleverly dubbed this chain patrilineage for the way such influence echoes down from genius man to genius man protege, and even in an insidious twist of internalized misogyny, from genius man to rare exception woman vaunted as different from other women because inheritor of male genius. The structures of art history were, from its inception, not designed to hold the stories, artworks, learnings, and teachings of indigenous artists, non-Western artists, artists of color, or women artists of any race or place. It's been the work of contemporary scholars to reshape the field of art history into a discipline interested in the world's cultural contributions and working from a broad range of traditions, searching through nearly lost archives, listening to previously marginalized voices, and following artworks into histories that an earlier concept of art history had left unresearched. I would be remiss if I did not briefly mention here that this important work is now directly under attack, with important cultural institutions receiving unprecedented political pressure directly from the US president to entrench Eurocentric white supremacist ways of thinking that scholars have spent the last 60 years unsettling. This political interference in scholarly work should be an affront to all of us, but it's especially vexing to those of us who look forward with hope to what art history is becoming. Art history is a living field that survives on our continuous curiosity about the past and, in the field of contemporary art, the present. Our willingness to keep learning from the primary documents of art is part of our commitment to a more just future. The list of exhibitions and projects that move toward this more just future is immense, and this current exhibition is an example of that important work and lineage. When I was invited to give this talk, I realized it would coincide with Gisela McDaniel's exhibition here, I realized that I had already seen McDaniel's work in the collection of the Baltimore Museum of Art when I was there for the opening of the Joan Mitchell retrospective. So in a way, Mitchell introduced me to McDaniel. As already mentioned, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Joan Mitchell and was involved with the retrospective exhibition and catalog that toured in 2021 and 23. For those unfamiliar with Mitchell, she was an American painter from Chicago who became part of the abstract expressionist scene and movement in New York in the early 1950s before moving to France in the later 50s, where she lived until she died in 1992. Mitchell is known for her large gestural, even muscular paintings that use the elements of abstract painting that seem so simple: color, gesture, form, space, scale, viscosity, color weight, and value in an orchestral, expressive virtuosity. Mitchell was steeped in the context that gave rise to a distinctively American, daring, New York-centric way of creating paintings, and then she painted all her life with a degree of independence and seriousness that were extremely rare for a woman in the 20th century. My dissertation focused on 1955 to 65, years during which Mitchell lived and worked between New York and Paris before permanently settling in France, first in Paris in 1959, and eventually in the rural enclave of Vautoy in 1967. As I dutifully researched, I began making notes about elements of Mitchell's life that interested me beyond the scope of the dissertation. Chiefly, I had a friend who we would always joke that, like, this is beyond the scope of the dissertation should be like a tattoo or something. everything that came up was seemingly beyond it. But the things that began to interest me beyond the scope of the dissertation were Mitchell's friendships and mentorships with younger artists. In the years since completing the dissertation, my research into the social world of young artists that surrounded Mitchell has opened onto the gorgeous and complex art historical questions of friendship and mentorship between artists that I'm now considering. This research is akin to touching a spider's web. Tracing Mitchell's contemporary relevance means, in part, following the threads of her belief in other artists and in the ways those artists grew into their fullness from the outline etched into their memories by Mitchell. As I have traced the ways Mitchell mattered to younger artists and they mattered to her, I have glimpsed a structure of influence that is not the top-down ladder of artistic schools and influence with which I began my talk, but something more elastic, relational, and supportive. Joan Mitchell's paintings hold the ephemeral experiences, feelings, commitments, and attachments the artist felt were integral to her work. I've spent the last few years researching the younger artists, mostly women, that Mitchell mentored in her Vautoy studio in France in the last decades of her life. And I just want to briefly say I love this photograph, which was shown to me by the painter Joyce Pinzotto before she died. And you can see Mitchell in the center, Mitchell's best friend, Giselle Barreau on your left, my right, and Joyce Pinzotto as a young woman there on my left, your right. But anyway, I think that it's a great example of a kind of unexpected aspect of an artist who we feel that we know quite well, to think about the ways that she opened up her home and studio and life to younger artists and mentored them. But returning to Mitchell's work, let's see. Oh, no, sorry, I was speaking about her mentorship. So outside the paintings themselves, Mitchell's letters with these young artists tell the story of how much the senior artist's example as a professional, full-time, working woman painter meant to them. It's also clear that these younger artists also saw the humanity in their elder and wanted to encourage her too. After a stay at Mitchell's home, the painter Joyce Pinzotto wrote to Mitchell, quote, "There are so few women painters one can look up to. You are one of them. Keep the brushes going." So you can see these kind of bilateral systems of support. Both in and outside her paintings, Mitchell referred to the people she loved. Her stunning diptych from 1975, Un Jardin pour Audrey, is titled for Art News editor and writer Thomas B. Hess's wife, Audrey, with whom Mitchell had enjoyed a beautiful lunch only a month before Audrey died suddenly. The garden in Mitchell's painting is a bower, a respite, a consolation for and about a lost person. So too, her immense 1981 painting, Adrita Fried, was named for Mitchell's beloved therapist of a quarter century. And there could be a whole talk on Adrita Fried. There's so much to say. Mitchell created paintings for people she had lost, and she also created paintings in tribute to her living friends. Quatuor for Betsy Jolas from 1975 is a magisterial quadriptych stretching more than 22 feet across, inspired by the composer and Mitchell's friend Betsy Jolas's composition of the same name. Mitchell described this painting as a key one for her. The painting developed over a year from a sketch Mitchell made of trees and fields out of a window. The humble drawing transformed into a massive 4-panel piece that draws together the remembered sound of Jolas's composition with Mitchell's view out the window and feeling for the massive green trees outside. The link between the natural world and Jolas's music and friendship is an affective one that the painting alone routes. The painting is singular as a space. Neither the representation of nature, nor the translation of music, nor an abstract portrait of a person, but a painting of the way Mitchell alone felt them all as part of her web. The way she alone could tumble them together in herself and make a singular painting that holds them all within it loosely and precisely. Mitchell's paintings were often expansive. Adrita Fried here is almost 25 feet across, and as I've just said, Quatuor for Betsy Jolas is 22 feet. And so their relationship to the artist physically and to the viewer and to the people to whom they refer envelops all of these different components in a kind of expansive holding. I see in Mitchell's clearly affiliative approach to making art one possible form of resistance to the linear concept of influence that fit artists into each other's shadows. I also see an antidote to the obliterating meanness and division of our own times and this connective approach to making art and writing art's histories. Today, I see a way forward in the way artists turn, like Mitchell did, to their communities and mutual care and lateral support, in the ways they claim each other. Here in Maine, for example, at every art event, including this one, I see Maine's incredible community of contemporary artists out supporting whoever is having a show or giving a talk. Hi, everybody. The feeling of mutual support, of care between artists in Maine, is one of the most stirring and nourishing aspects of the arts here. In its continual force of connection, it influences what contemporary artists in Maine and beyond think about, pay attention to, celebrate, and process into their work in the studio. One of the clearest examples of how this mutual support can operate in artworks themselves is here in this room with Gisela McDaniel's exhibition. To return to my first encounter with McDaniel's work in Baltimore, the first of the paintings of hers that I saw was her 2020 painting, What She Saw, Where She Went. The work is a triple portrait of 3 women sitting together on a couch, their bodies in the close and inward tilting lean of relatives fitting themselves into the frame of a picture. The work includes, to quote the label, found objects, flowers, photograph, resin, and recorded sound. I remember being struck by the intensity of McDaniel putting the subjects, their precious objects, their names and identities, and their voices into the piece itself. This was one of the pieces that McDaniel made during this time that had a motion sensor in the painting. So when you would approach the painting, it would sort of start speaking to you. It would tell you the stories of the people in the painting. The Mitchell exhibition in the same museum had included a soundscape that had thoughtfully restored subtle experiential context to Mitchell's paintings. In McDaniel's work, I was struck by the idea that the artist had done it all herself, had scraped as much world around the painting as she could into it, so that none of it had to be filled in later by others. She expanded the container of painting to include sound, object, time. McDaniel's paintings thus did more than represent their subjects. They acted as witnesses and confidants. They were like reliquaries or safe rooms, holding each subject's precious artifacts, stories, poses, and environments in trust. The painting is a gesture of respect and an archive of connection. McDaniel's creatively synthesized representation of lives holds both the subject and her story, inviting the viewer's curious approach while responding with the recorded voices of the sitters to whoever stands before the record she's created. You'll notice immediately in this room, I can't remember exactly where in the show this painting is. Is it in there? Okay, yes. See, Sophie's here to guide. So in there, you can see me, you can see the professor side. I'm always pointing at something. You'll notice immediately McDaniel's high-keyed palette that she links to the brilliantly hued landscape of Guam. And soon you'll notice the thickness of the paintings as objects, the way they have physical depth. As you spend time with these works, you might admire McDaniel's fluency with the materiality of paint. She paints in thin washes, gestural strokes, impasto accretions where paint mixes with earth, and in slick, piped rivulets that meander unexpectedly in tightly kinked folds. Then you might notice objects. Plants, jewelry, pearls, butterfly wings, a brooch, a tooth come into view. The paintings are paintings, but they're also archives. They house their subjects even as they share fragments of their worlds with us. In Ballymessignon, Lily, a Chamorro lawyer, human rights advocate, and friend of the artist, poses in her New York apartment surrounded by important signifiers of her work and commitments. The artist works with her subject to build a kind of diegetic world within the painting that is self-sustaining before transforming the image into a painted accretion of person, place, treasure, and time. Okay, I love this word diegetic, if I can just briefly go into it, which just comes out of film studies. But like if you're watching a movie and there's a scene happening in a room, then that room is the diegetic space of the film. It's like the space within the film space. So I like this idea in these paintings of the diegetic because it's like you're looking into a scene that's in progress. You're looking into a world that exists within the painting. Just realize when you use a grad school word, you have to like back it up. In McDaniel's painting Equanimity, which fortunately is right here, you can check the color, of the slide. It's very convenient. A woman sits on a simple swing held between its blue tethers, her head tilting slightly to the right. Behind her, a glassy river glides over stones, turbulent in its tumble into the painting's middle ground, and then illuminated by what seems an implied sunset, pink reds and maroons branching over the water's rushing calm as the river meets the sitter's fluorescent pink toes. The artwork label identifies this place as Tinago Falls in Guam, a place representative of a sacred connection between Guam's indigenous people and water. The sitter is an environmental activist working to protect the very waters with which she poses. As with other paintings, the painting reserves its most saturated hues for the sitter herself, who is painted in a high-key palette. Her neon pink bathing suit and her irradiated feet connect via a pink underpainted leg whose strong angle supports the subject's powerful, active presence. Strikingly, her face is underpainted with more naturalistic tones, and her expression conveys warmth and interest. Her head's tilt suggests listening and attention. McDaniel has embellished the sitter's face with impasto lines of fluorescent piped paint. Embedded in the painting's surface are small beads, shells, jewels, and a floral brooch. A moire, a palm leaf headdress, which you can see just here, rests on the painting's upper edge, as if left there by someone holding on to the occasion that produced it. In the recording that accompanies this painting, the sitter explains her connection to Guam, and in particular, to indigenous ways of understanding the relationship between humans and our environment. This is a quote from her from that recorded interview. "Walk in kindness with grace and light. Walk as with every natural living being," she explains, continuing, "When you think about it, if you walk as an equal to every natural living being, then you're going to be at peace with everything. Everything's going to be in its own order. When you look at colonialism, when you look at climate change, the reasons for climate change were dominated by a society that wants to dominate everything else." McDaniel's painting in holding together a sacred space and an indigenous perspective on living in mutual connection with the environment, together with treasured objects and the artist's unique methods of figuration, involves the viewer as a listener, as a learner, and as a seer. The painting holds the recorded conversation between the artist and sitter and some of the objects that connected them in its material, but they also hold on to us, the viewers, whoever we are. The politics of this painting and others function, again, like a web, holding on to the moment of connection they show us, but holding us too in its matrix. The space of the subject's pose also contains the conversation between subject and artist that accompanied the sitting. Speaking enters the space of the painting, and also thinking back to that 2020 piece, building air into painted space that vibrates with the shared understandings that have been spoken into its container. You can see this literalized in the painting created for such a time as this, which is around the wall in this room, in which a pine bough burned as smoke medicine during the artist's conversation with the sitters is incorporated in the finished piece. So there's sort of something of the experience of that conversation that survives into the piece. The relationship between personal disclosure and testimony blurs here, refusing any separation between friendship and archive, and especially any separation between the bodies of people bearing witness to histories of colonization they have survived and are surviving in the space of art. McDaniel's practice of including the exchange of gifts enriches the surface of her paintings. She describes her practice of inviting subjects to gift objects to the painting as drawn from Chamorro culture's emphasis on gift giving. I think this is also a really interesting distinction that she made in her comments here between the idea of giving the gift to the sitter or to the artist and the idea of giving it to the painting. It gives the artist a kind of personhood almost, it gives the painting a kind of personhood, as if it sort of survives as an entity itself. So this is connected for her to the tradition of gift giving in Chamorro culture. What would a consensual artifact look like? She asked rhetorically in her recent talk here at OMAA. She describes a consensual artifact as, quote, something that's contributed, and you choose something you want to be remembered with, rather than a stolen artifact, which is mostly the story, meaning the sort of story of how a lot of artifacts have entered collections. Embedded in the painting, pieces of jewelry. Oops, that's the one that was created for such a time as this. Missed the slide. Here's a close-up, although you're probably able to see just as well from where you're sitting. Embedded in the painting, pieces of jewelry, shells, fish bones, and teeth transmogrify into the traditional format of painting, flickering between personally significant treasure and the most recognizable of our fine art objects, paintings themselves. In so doing, they bridge the shared moment of connection between sitter and artist that attended their making when the artist invited the sitter to bring those objects of their choosing and to sit for the artist in the ways they selected, and then also connects that with the anonymous viewer's moment of seeing image and object aggregated in a portrait. Further complicating this exchange of experiences, recordings already alluded to are available to hear while standing in front of the painting, inviting the viewer to look and listen and see the physical remnants of something of the sitter's life, and be invited into the space of connection the artist created while making the work. Inviting us into this deep camaraderie of McDaniel's community and their personal disclosures, spaces, and treasures, the paintings carry the Chamorro value of ingoflie, which the exhibition label for the work of the same name translates as recognizing the dignity in others and fostering mutual respect. They are spaces that invite us to step into McDaniel's community and into our own with ingoflie, with mutual respect and recognition of each person's dignity. Here in Gisela McDaniel's show, it's clear that she is an artist who, like the historian of contemporary art, thinks historically in the present. Her paintings are archives and they're safe rooms. They hold people she values in safety, using arts economies like the cultural convention of art spaces as secular temples. This is a very beautiful one. And the archiving expertise of art institutions, again, like this fabulous one, to safeguard the stories, countenances, beloved spaces, and treasured objects of her treasured people. She uses paintings to protect her community and to invite us to witness and learn from its brilliance. We're a long way now from the European origins of art history with which we began our conversation. Those firm classifications of influence by school and style feel, at least to this art historian, like Diderot's encyclopédie might in our moment of AI, which is to say that the past is visible in our present and in its ambitions. But time and human striving have reshaped the world that past thinkers tried to name and thus contain. Our current moment invites approaches to art history that are more like McDaniel's approach to portraiture: collaborative, curious, generous, affiliative. In our moment, we can study histories of art that are lateral, personal, and informal, as well as those in which an artist studied in a school under her teachers. Of course, both are true of Gisela McDaniel. Indeed, we can and should study both. The picture, like McDaniel's canvases, can grow thicker with histories and stories. Outside a linear model of artistic influence and progression, artworks might be crossings of people and their affiliations, a web of relationships and meanings that hum in the winds of our time, even when they howl. In McDaniel's works, paintings hold so much out to us. The subject, their treasures, and their stories, all massed close to the surface, even as they extend out from the wall, almost body-like in their thickness. These paintings and their collaged artifacts extend into the range of our touch, asking us to step into a close but still respectful distance. As McDaniel said in her comments here, quote, "I spent a lot of time in museums and feeling like a lot of the women were silenced, and I just wanted people to be able to speak for themselves. I used to do a lot of motion sensor paintings, which I'm going to bring back. But the whole idea was that if you want to come into the personal space of the person, you have to listen to them. And if you don't want to listen to them, you can respectfully stand a little further away." The social surround of contemporary art, often unspoken, glimpsed in titles and archives, remembered in memoirs and biographies. In McDaniel's work is the passionate subject. Her work dignifies and shares the intimacies of trust and history, of gift-giving and receiving, of words known to Chamorro women sharing an afternoon near or far from their ancestral lands and waters. The way these paintings open to us, share with us, and trust us is almost incomprehensibly generous. It is a gift we work to receive with our time, attention, vision, and feeling. McDaniel's paintings remind us that we're guests and also welcome us as guests. These paintings contribute to art history, and they materialize affiliative art historical possibilities. In their generous presence, perhaps the thing to say is thank you. Thank you for inviting us in. Thank you for being with us. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if you have them. Yes?
What does the heavy Picasso facial painting symbolize?
This is a great question. The question was, just for the recording, what the impasto on the faces symbolize. I had the same question, and I learned from researching the artist and her work that in a previous version of her work, and Sophie, if I make mistakes, you can jump in, that in a previous series of her work, she was primarily working with survivors of sexual assault, and that she was painting them masked to protect their identities and to sort of be a barrier between the sitter and the viewer. And then as she worked, the work sort of started to change, and some of those masking techniques didn't sort of fit anymore, her ideas as an artist. And so it became more a question of kind of adornment or a kind of dignifying of the faces of the sitters that highlights them without fully sort of concealing them. And also her subjects changed as well, where like she's moved on from a sort of close emphasis on working with survivors of sexual assault to work with a broader range of subjects. So I think that's also connected to how the techniques she's using changed. Do you have any corrections, Sophie? Okay, yeah, great. It's a great question. I had the same curiosity. Yes, Reed.
I love that photo of Joyce Pensano and Joan Mitchell in France.
Yes, me too.
It's so strange that you're showing this because I just learned that she was Joyce Pensano's mentor. And it's like when you learn a new word and you see it everywhere. And see like how each painter knows who they are on the surface. And I just wondered if you could speak about the viscosity in either of those people, any of those three people, and what that means.
Yeah, I absolutely love this question. And to briefly summarize it, again, just for the recording, this is also me thinking like someone who teaches on Zoom all the time and then has those recorded lectures. But Reed's great question was about viscosity in paint and mentorship among painters, or as I understood it, and the relationship of the viscosity of paint and how it moves over the surface to the painter's individuality. And Joan Mitchell, if you see those paintings in person, it's so clear that she has this fluency with paint, that she can move paint and use color in whatever way she chooses. I often use these sound metaphors because she loved music, and I think she thought a lot about music in her paintings, but the kind of conducting aspect of working with paint in all these complex ways you're talking about. And Joan Mitchell was very influenced by Van Gogh, and was very interested in light in painting and in the relationship of color to light. And she and Joyce Pinzotto used to argue with each other about painting, because Joan Mitchell was always criticizing Joyce Pinzotto for being expressionist, for using darkness instead of light. And then Joyce Pinzotto had to sort of be like, yeah, I am expressionist, that's what I do. But to your point, moving into enamel, in the case of Joyce Pinzotto, working super messy. This is a very small anecdote aside, but when I went to Joyce Pinzotto's studio, when I was writing my dissertation, it was like August in New York. It was so hot. It was just like sweaty August in New York, and I went to her studio, and I walked in, and she said, "You're so clean." I was totally stunned. I didn't know what to say, but then when I walked into her studio, I kind of saw why, because her studio was like, it was like it had been hit by a paint tornado. You know, it was just like paint everywhere. And so I think the kind of sense of just the movement of paint was so elemental to Joyce Pinzotto. So I think it really did become part of her way of seeing herself and of using paint. And I think with these paintings, you can see, I think, Gisela McDaniel thinking about objects as if they were paint. And so I think as I've been looking at these, the way that, like in this one to my right, there's a kind of like dangly chain painting thing happening. And the way that she's really playing with this idea about how an object could move like paint, or how something could stick to paint, in the way that you're talking about the stickiness. So I do think that you're onto something about just the way that painters are looking not only at what each other paint and how they paint it, but like the feeling of how that material sticks to the canvas and moves over the canvas. There are so many painters in here tonight, I feel self-conscious, so you can speak up if you have other things to say, but that's what I would say about that. Yes?
You're probably aware that we had an exhibit here of Lee Crafts.
Yes, that's how I met Sophie, is that I had her speak to my students.
Looking at these photos and thinking of all of the women that work together, kind of pushing back against them not even being recognized and forming their own community.
Yeah.
And I think that was important for all of them.
I definitely think so. I think it could be complicated. Lee Krasner was sort of one generation older than Joan Mitchell, maybe even sort of 2 generations older than Joan Mitchell. And I think, I think sometimes she felt like women of Joan Mitchell's generation had it easier, but they all recognized in each other's lives and work, I think, that they were up against similar dynamics that took different forms in different time periods. Like I think of Lee Krasner being so successful and working through those WPA years and being like this extremely talented and successful and connecting person in that scene as well. And then being largely remembered now as like Jackson Pollock's wife, is like really a sort of example of the continuing difficulty of women's reputations, I think, and how hard it is to keep the person and their work in view at the same time when it comes to women painters. And so it's something I think is a great point. And I always run the risk in talking about the difficulties that women artists faced of making it seem like you just couldn't do it and there was nobody. There were women who did, just like you say, Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, Grace Hartigan, Elaine de Kooning. There's so many painters around this time that are doing it, but it is really still proportionally, they're in the minority, and for structural reasons. Yeah, that they pushed against all the time, to your great point. So it's not like they were like, woe is us. They were always, they were always pushing, yeah. Yeah, Sophie.
I love the connection you made. I'm thinking about time and the audio component as well, and seeing the great painting by Joan Mitchell of the composition and music composition coming in. So the shared interest in music and the oral audio components. Could you speak a little bit more to that, of how audio, time, how this just was an outlet for Mitchell and Gisela to kind of push back against those dynamics a bit more, power structures? That just is such an interesting shared component that I hadn't thought about before.
Yes, I think that the cultural elements that artists love and connect to and bring into their studios and feel inspired by are deeply important. And I think, like, you know, Joan Mitchell was so moved by, especially music and poetry, just a passionate listener to, there are particular records that she listened to, it seems like constantly. She was like always listening to music in her studio. She worked at night, so shout out to all of you fellow night owls. We matter in this world. But she would work all night and listen to music, and her close people were often poets and musicians, Betsy Jolas, but also Giselle Barreau, who was Joan Mitchell's best friend. They lived together in the house in Vitoya until Joan Mitchell died, and Giselle Barreau still lives in the house where they lived together. So that deep connection through friendship. Giselle Barreau is an incredible composer, and there was often a kind of exchange of like something that Giselle was working on, and then something that Mitchell was working on, and them talking these things over together. And in the case of Gisela, I feel like the way that she is incorporating these worlds in a direct way. I loved what she said in her comments about manicures in particular. I realize this might be a strange connection to make, but I think, like, yeah, the idea of self-care and of like a cultural sign of connection, you know, having something that somebody else recognizes and can feel connected to. I think something that's interesting when artists are sort of signaling to each other in their work, or talking to each other internally in their work. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
I do have a question. As an art historian, how do you think about the messaging that an artist is trying to do with their painting? This artist is messaging, you inspire a question. With the way an observer really experiences the painting, and is one more important than the other?
It's a great question. I think it's something that anyone who writes about art thinks about, especially because what's the sort of, how much say does the artist retain over how their work is received, I think maybe is how I understand your question. And I think that is something that art historians and art critics have been thinking about a lot, especially in the past 40 or 50 years, as we've had a more diverse group of artists and writers sort of coming into contact with each other. And so I think that for myself, my own sort of boundary about it is that I try to really immerse myself in understanding the artist's perspective when I set out to write about someone. And then I kind of let the process of writing take over and evolve, and I read other kinds of materials, and I think through other kinds of histories as frameworks. And so I guess the sort of neat answer in a certain way is that the artist's take on their own work is one source on it that I weight heavily, but that I take as one source. And then I sort of draw it together with other things that I learn and try to understand that amalgamation together. And it's important to me to keep the artist's intentions in view, because just out of respect for what that process is. And I also feel like it's part of my responsibility to wander a little bit too, because maybe there are things that I find in the work that the artist didn't realize could be in there. So I really do think it can be a kind of fruitful dialogue and exchange at its best. Of course, it can go wrong, but I think I think that at its best, it can be a kind of fruitful dialogue. Yeah, in the back.
Could you talk a little bit about the way in which the canvas is on this box-like structure, that with the continuation of the painting on the side, what contains it and its space?
Yes.
I don't see anything underneath, so I'm assuming that there's probably not anything on top.
I love this question, and it's one where I can, Sophie can jump in if there are things that I don't know, but I would say from what I understand about Gisella's work, that there's the way that the painting is really existing as an object and sort of moving into space in terms of its physicality and also the sort of sonic component of the recorded interviews. But I think it's meant to kind of like push against the space it's in. Like there's one around the corner, if you go into this other gallery that's on the right, where the top of the painting has pretty clearly been painted like this fluorescent pink that she often uses. Yes, and it casts a kind of halo on the wall above it. And to me, I think, the sort of conventions of showing art are that often you're showing paintings against a bright white wall. Not always, but sometimes. Often you're showing paintings against a bright white wall. And so I think that I think it's a way that they cause a good kind of trouble in an art space, and the way they stick out where we are in a kind of productive way. Like I'm thinking of Eva Hess's sculpture Hang Up. Maybe some of you have seen that one, where it's like a frame that has what looks like a big picture wire that goes way out into the gallery space. It's like you could trip over it. There's always like a guard who's standing there like waiting to make sure nobody trips over it. But I think that their thickness is partially, for some of them, a function of the way that they used to contain, I think at one point, motion sensors. Like it was practical that they contained technology to keep track of who's in front of them. But I think that maybe I read their thickness and the way that the sides are painted and adorned as causing, like sort of throwing out some elbows into the space around it in a way that is different than other conventions of painting. Are there things you want to add, Sophie? Okay. Yeah. Yes.
So, if you come upon a painting, if you don't have the background or that knowledge you gave us, and you just look at it, and you're looking at it from top down, and there are many layers, so that the artists themselves, they have a story, a background behind it. And I would imagine they start with blank canvas, and then they start building maybe like an onion from the very core, and then they layer up. I would come across something, and my first impression would be, what is trying to be said with this painting? And without the background and the depth, unless you actually sit there and try to just imagine what's going on, and take the time to do that with one painting, how far down would you be able to drill into that core essence of what is actually trying to be said?
This is a great question, and I think it goes to the kind of like ways that people can connect to an artwork that you may not have the background or the museum label. Like this show has beautiful museum labels on everything, so you get more background on things, but sometimes you'll encounter an artwork sort of cold without any of those sort of explanatory structures around. And you are at a sort of disadvantage because the artist starts from the bottom up and builds something, and then you're coming in from the top down, so to speak. You're seeing it as a finished thing and trying to understand how it exists or came into existence or what it means. And so some of the ways that I described the paintings in my writing is sort of an example of how I approach a painting, which is to look really closely and to try and approach it with curiosity and try and wonder, well, why is this way? Like, why is this sitter not quite in the middle, just a little bit off center? You know, why is the sitter like sort of in this really fluorescent, like sort of traffic cone level of pink while also being in this natural space? Like, what does that contrast bring into the image? And so I think trying to first sort of sit with the painting and try and learn from it, or try and even like absorb it, like sort of without coming to any immediate conclusions, just kind of giving it a lot of slow looking, I find often brings me to questions that that then when I go looking for answers, there's a richness there that I might not have first perceived. And also I want to give everybody an out, because in every museum you can't sort of spend an hour with every painting, so there are going to be ones that you walk by, but hopefully life is long and you can spend time with that one next time. So I think there's a way in which paintings, especially, I mean, paintings are what I know best and what I'm most drawn to often, but I think that approaching them with curiosity and watching, sort of observing your own observation is a way to get deeper into the painting without having a lot of other structures to help you. I often look at the painting first, and then after spending some time with it, read the label, because I sometimes feel that I can jump to conclusions and be like, okay, well, that's what that's about, and you know, moving swiftly onward, whereas if I had sat with the painting first, I might have a different perspective. Yes?
Has spoken about paint and its viscosity, and its thickness, its weight, and that's all it is. And that is how it communicates with the viewer. Joan Mitchell had a method to build a kind of weight and flow at the same time. And is in talking about a painter's intention. Agnes Martin has written beautifully on intention. And her dealer, when he was out in her studio in the desert, asked her, well, what do you think is supposed to happen when the work leaves? She goes, not my job.
None of my business, right? Yeah.
The paintings will deliver whatever people see in them. And that's all her job was. That's what she did. She painted paintings. And she didn't have a reason to paint anything. She described her process as sitting and waiting, as long as it took, for inspiration. And then when she painted, her job was to keep the attention alive and pay attention and not let it just drift away.
I think Agnes Martin is an amazing example to bring into the conversation, and probably a lot of you will know her work, and some will know her work less. But there are these often just white grounds with these beautiful penciled lines over the surface. Some of them have some of them she got wild. Some of them have color, but they're incredibly affecting to see. They're very frustrating to teach as an art historian, because you put them up on the screen and people are like, what? But they really have to be seen in person. But I think to your point, the artist's intention and care and work in making them is a sort of process-based practice that imbues the artworks with whatever it is they carry with them. And of course, much has been written about her work. And so there's always the possibility of people stepping in and seeing things and understanding things about an artist's work that they didn't intend. But I think that there's something very generous in Agnes Martin sort of being willing to step back from interpretation and to just make the work as exact as she could make it in the ways that she had envisioned, and then to let it into the world. So I think she's a great example of another way. I mean, some artists say a lot about their work and others say almost nothing. The abstract expressionists that I was writing about, they loved to say as little as possible, making the job of the art historian sometimes difficult, but I think it's a great... Yeah. She's also, wasn't she very connected to ideas of Taoism? Was that part of her tradition? Yeah. So I think sort of a philosophical approach to creativity and to what the creative process looks like. She's a great person to bring up. Should we take, what do you think, Sophie? Should we take one more? Okay, Jean.
So you alluded, I can't remember if it was here or somewhere else, but I read too that you're interested in studying your friendships between painters and mentorship, and it sounds like you're exploring that, maybe it's what you're doing now, and I'm just curious if you're willing to let us hear a little bit more. Is that going to be through the lens of Joan Mitchell and peer group of that, or is it going to be taken into other areas or realms? I'm just curious where you're, because I'm very interested in that.
This is such a generous comment to me, or question to me, so thank you, I appreciate that. And I've been writing, well, I started out thinking I could explore this idea through Joan Mitchell Best, this idea of mentorship and friendship and painting, because I had the stuff, because I had done all this research for years and I had these materials to work from. And I also went down to the Joan Mitchell Foundation in New York maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, and I read all of these incredible letters between Joan Mitchell and these women that she mentored, along with my research assistant at the time. Shout out to Sally Wagley, who helped me a lot. And so I kind of started there, and I did some writing about that. And I've also been thinking recently about other sort of experimental approaches to art history. So I just wrote recently a chapter for a book that's coming out called Speculative Histories that is about my friendship with the painter Susie Spence, and the semester when I had a teaching appointment in New York and was between places, and so I lived with her, and we had this funny, like thrown together domestic situation of an artist and an art historian talking about art all the time. And so I've been thinking about it through the more sort of formalized practices of art history that I was trained in, and also trying to think of it in the field of sort of personal essay, or I also am inspired by some of the critics of the New York School that were just sort of shamelessly part of what they were writing about. I'm thinking of like Irving Sandler or Lucy Lepard, or who was a little later, but and still living and fabulous. But I think I'm interested in those ways of not sort of taking yourself out of the picture and giving yourself a sort of special outside pedestal, but just admitting that you're part of the world like everybody else, and thinking about what that means as a writer and art historian. So thank you. What a pleasure, thank you.